The architecture of achievement. There is a moment, just before any great achievement, when the thing does not yet exist anywhere except inside a single mind. No one can see it, no one can measure it. It has no weight, no shape, no proof. And yet, from that invisible moment, entire fortunes get built, entire inventions get assembled, entire lives get rewritten. This has happened so many times across human history that it can no longer be called coincidence. There is a mechanism underneath it, a working architecture, the same in every case, regardless of the era, regardless of the person, regardless of the field. Tonight we are going to walk through that architecture, piece by piece, until you can see exactly how a thought, treated correctly, becomes a thing. The thought that becomes a thing. Every structure standing in the physical world today was at some earlier point nothing but an idea held in someone's mind, unverified, unproven, and entirely invisible to everyone else. The building you live in, the vehicle you drive, the systems that deliver power to your home and food to your table. None of it existed in matter first. All of it existed in thought first, and matter simply followed, late, the way it always does. This single fact, properly understood, should change how you treat your own ideas. The thought sitting in your mind right now, the one you've perhaps dismissed as unrealistic or premature, is operating under the exact same law that built everything currently surrounding you. The only variable that determines whether it remains a private thought or becomes a public reality is what you do with it next. Consider how strange it actually is that a species capable of building cities, bridges, and entire systems of trade still treats its own ideas with so little ceremony. A man will spend a fortune protecting a physical asset, insuring it, locking it away, guarding it from theft, while the single most valuable thing he owns, an original idea capable of reshaping his circumstances entirely, gets mentioned once in passing conversation, and then forgotten by morning. The architecture described in this lecture exists precisely to correct that imbalance, to give the invisible thought the same seriousness eventually given to the visible result it's capable of producing. Every achievement of consequence begins with a desire sharp enough to survive contact with difficulty. Not a passing wish, easily abandoned the moment resistance shows up, but a desire with enough heat behind it to keep moving forward when every visible sign suggests turning back. This kind of desire is rare, not because people lack ambition, but because most ambition gets diluted the instant it meets its first obstacle. The desire that actually produces results is the one that is already decided, before any obstacle arrives, that obstacles are simply part of the terrain rather than a signal to stop walking. If you've ever wondered why some people achieve what looks impossible while others abandon goals that looked far easier, the difference is almost never talent. It's the heat behind the original desire, and how much of that heat survived the first real test. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives once a desire has been tested by real difficulty and has survived it intact. Before the test, desire is simply an idea about what might feel good to have. After the test, desire becomes evidence, gathered firsthand, that this specific aim was never a passing interest in the first place. This is why so many of the strongest ambitions in human history were forged not in comfort, but in circumstances that should have, by every reasonable measure, extinguished them entirely. The fire that should have ended the desire instead proved what kind of desire it actually was. Why most desire dies at first contact. It is worth pausing here to examine exactly why most desire fails this early test, because understanding the mechanism of failure is often more instructive than studying the mechanism of success. Most desire dies at first contact with difficulty because it was never actually anchored to anything beyond the feeling of wanting. The moment the feeling fades, which it always eventually does, there's nothing left holding the desire in place. This is the trap of relying on motivation as the engine of pursuit. Motivation is by its nature temporary, dependent on mood, energy, recent events, and a dozen other variables outside conscious control. A desire anchored only to motivation will only survive exactly as long as the motivation does, which is rarely long enough to outlast the first serious obstacle. The desire that survives is anchored instead to something sturdier than feeling, a reason substantial enough to remain standing even on the days the feeling has completely disappeared. Faith as disciplined expectation. Faith, properly understood, is not blind optimism detached from effort. It is a disciplined state of expectation deliberately maintained that treats the desired outcome as inevitable long before any evidence confirms it. This state has to be built the same way any discipline is built, through repetition, through the conscious choice to imagine the outcome vividly and specifically, again and again, until the mind starts treating that imagined outcome with the same weight it gives to memories of things that have already happened. This is not wishful thinking. It is mental rehearsal performed deliberately that trains the same machinery used for memory and prediction to start favoring the outcome you actually want, rather than defaulting, as it usually does, toward the outcome you secretly fear. Consider how the mind already does this constantly, automatically in the opposite direction. A person anxious about an upcoming conversation will rehearse, often unconsciously, dozens of negative outcomes before the conversation ever happens, building a kind of false memory of failure that hasn't occurred yet. Faith simply takes this exact same machinery, the one already running by default in most people, and points it deliberately toward the outcome desired instead of the outcome feared. The mechanism was never the problem. The direction it had been pointed in was the problem. And direction, unlike the mechanism itself, is entirely a matter of choice. The conversation with your deeper mind. Beneath conscious awareness, there is a second layer of mind that receives instructions constantly, whether or not you're paying attention to what you're sending it. Left unmanaged, this deeper layer absorbs whatever thoughts happen to dominate your day. Frustration, doubt, comparison, fear, and quietly organizes your habits, your posture, and your decisions around whatever message it's been fed most consistently. Managed deliberately, this same layer can be given a specific, repeated instruction instead, one chosen on purpose rather than absorbed by accident. This is not a matter of reciting empty phrases without feeling behind them. It is a matter of repeatedly, vividly, with real emotional investment, feeding your deeper mind the exact instruction you want it operating on, until that instruction becomes as automatic as the doubt it's replacing once was. The timing of this practice matters more than most people realize. The deeper mind is most receptive in the quiet stretches just before sleep and just after waking, when the analytical, skeptical layer of conscious thought has not yet fully engaged. A few minutes of deliberate, emotionally vivid repetition during those windows accomplishes more than hours of distracted affirmation attempted during a busy, noisy day. This is not mysticism. It is simply working with the actual operating conditions of the instrument, rather than against them. Knowledge organized toward a purpose. Information by itself accomplishes nothing. Libraries full of accurate, useful knowledge sit untouched every single day, producing exactly nothing, because knowledge requires direction before it becomes power. The specific knowledge that matters is not necessarily the knowledge you already possess. It's the knowledge required for your specific aim, gathered deliberately, organized clearly, and applied immediately, rather than collected indefinitely as a substitute for action. There is a particular kind of person who spends years accumulating credentials, certifications, and expertise, convinced that the accumulation itself is the achievement. It isn't. Knowledge that never gets organized toward a specific purpose and then acted upon is simply potential energy, stored indefinitely, producing nothing until it's finally converted into motion. The danger of collecting without applying, it's worth naming directly why this particular trap catches intelligent, disciplined people more often than it catches anyone else. Collecting knowledge feels productive. It feels like progress, because each new fact learned produces a small, satisfying sense of forward movement. Applying knowledge feels riskier, because application invites the possibility of being wrong, of discovering that the knowledge wasn't as complete as it seemed, of facing a result that doesn't match the theory. This is precisely why so many capable people remain perpetual students of their field without ever becoming practitioners of it. Studying carries no risk of public failure. Doing carries that risk fully. The architecture of achievement requires crossing that line deliberately, accepting the risk that application always carries, because no amount of additional study has ever substituted for the specific lessons only available through actually attempting the thing. Imagination as the workshop. Every invention, every business, every solution to a problem that previously seemed unsolvable was assembled first inside imagination, long before it was assembled in matter. Imagination is not decoration. It is the actual workshop where raw material, existing ideas, existing knowledge, existing observations gets recombined into something that didn't exist in that exact configuration before. This is why exposure matters so much. A mind starved of new input has less raw material to recombine and produces, predictably, fewer original combinations. A mind deliberately fed new experiences, new fields of knowledge, new conversations outside its usual circle has exponentially more raw material available, and imagination given more to work with produces more worth building. It is worth noting that imagination operates best not under pressure, but in the quiet, unstructured stretches most people consider wasted time. A walk without a destination, a shower taken without checking a device immediately afterward, a long drive with no podcast filling the silence. The workshop requires some idle time to actually assemble anything, and a mind constantly occupied with input from the outside world rarely gets the uninterrupted stretch it needs to do its quieter, recombinant work. Planning as crystallized desire. A desire without a plan remains a desire indefinitely, drifting, hopeful, ungrounded. A plan is simply that same desire, given structure, given sequence, given a series of specific next actions that can actually be performed rather than simply hoped for. This step trips up far more people than it should, because planning feels less exciting than dreaming, and most people would rather continue dreaming indefinitely than risk the discomfort of a plan that might need revising. But a plan, even an imperfect one, immediately revised the moment new information arrives, will always outperform an unstructured desire left to wander without direction. The plan doesn't need to be perfect at the start. It needs to exist, and it needs to be specific enough to act on today. There is a particular comfort available to anyone willing to release the idea that the first plan must be the correct plan. Treating a plan as a living document, expected to be revised repeatedly as new information becomes available, removes nearly all of the pressure that keeps so many people stuck in the planning phase indefinitely, terrified of committing to a sequence that might later prove wrong. Every workable plan in history was revised multiple times along the way. The revision was never evidence of poor planning. It was simply evidence that the planning process was actually functioning the way it was supposed to. Decision is the end of drifting. Indecision is the quiet thief of nearly every unrealized ambition in human history. Not dramatic failure, not catastrophic setback, simply the slow accumulation of decisions delayed, postponed, reconsidered endlessly without resolution, until the opportunity that required a decision has already passed by unnoticed. The capacity to decide promptly, once sufficient information is gathered, and then to hold that decision firmly against the doubt that inevitably follows, is one of the rarest and most valuable habits a person can develop. Most people reverse this process entirely, deciding slowly and reluctantly, then abandoning the decision the instant it's questioned. Reverse it back, decide promptly, hold the decision firmly, revise it only when genuinely new information demands revision, not simply because doubt has resurfaced for the 100th time. There's a particular kind of exhaustion unique to chronic indecision that rarely gets discussed directly. A decision delayed does not actually rest the mind. It keeps the matter circulating unresolved, consuming background mental energy day after day, often for far longer than the decision itself would have taken to simply make and move past. Prompt decision, even an imperfect one, frees an enormous amount of mental energy that indecision had been quietly consuming the entire time it remained unresolved. Persistence as sustained will. Persistence is the discipline that determines whether everything described so far ever actually produces a result. Because every one of these principles, desire, faith, planning, decision, eventually meets resistance. And resistance is precisely where most people stop. Persistence is simply the decision to continue anyway, repeated daily, often without any visible encouragement that continuing is working. This is uncomfortable to hear because it removes the excuse that difficulty itself is evidence you should quit. Difficulty was never the signal to stop. It was always, in every account of achievement worth studying, simply the price charged for the achievement, paid in advance, before the achievement itself ever arrives. Why the hardest stretch precedes the breakthrough? There is a tragic and remarkably common pattern across nearly every account of struggle and eventual success. The quitting almost always happens in the exact stretch right before the turning point, the stretch where the resistance is at its absolute highest, which is also, without exception, the stretch right before that resistance finally breaks. You cannot see the turning point coming from inside the difficulty. It does not announce itself in advance. It simply arrives suddenly after a long enough stretch of continued effort. And the tragedy is that so many stop exactly one effort short of reaching it, having no way of knowing how close they actually were. This is precisely why persistence cannot be conditional on visible progress. The visible progress in the hardest stretch is often the least available it has ever been, right up until the moment it suddenly isn't. The power of combined minds. No mind, however capable, operates at its full potential in complete isolation. There is a measurable, repeatedly observed phenomenon that occurs when two or more minds, genuinely aligned around a shared purpose, combine their thinking. A kind of intelligence emerges that neither mind could have produced entirely alone. This is not simply division of labor. It's something closer to a third mind forming in the space between two committed people, generating insight, momentum, and resilience that exceeds what either person carries individually. Surrounding yourself deliberately with a small number of minds aligned toward your purpose is not a luxury reserved for those who've already succeeded. It is one of the actual mechanisms by which success becomes more likely in the first place. There is also a protective quality to this alignment that's easy to overlook. A single mind working in isolation through a difficult stretch has no external check against its own distorted thinking during moments of exhaustion or fear. A small group of aligned minds provides exactly that check, catching distortions in each other's thinking long before those distortions can fully take hold and derail months of otherwise sound effort. Transmuting emotion into purpose. Intense emotion left undirected simply consumes the person experiencing it. Anger without an outlet curdles into bitterness. Longing without direction collapses into despair. Grief without purpose calcifies into permanent weight. But that same emotional intensity, deliberately redirected toward constructive work, becomes one of the most powerful sources of sustained energy a person can access. This redirection is not denial of the emotion. It is the conscious decision to point an already existing force toward something worth building, rather than allowing it to simply burn through the person carrying it with nothing constructive to show for the burning. Some of the most extraordinary periods of human productivity have come directly from people who learned to redirect their hardest emotions into their most important work. rather than waiting for the emotion to pass before attempting anything at all. There is a practical method hiding inside this principle that deserves direct mention. The next time an intense emotion arrives, rather than immediately suppressing it or immediately venting it outward without direction, try channeling that exact energy into the specific work connected to your purpose. The emotion doesn't disappear in this process. It simply changes destination, and the resulting output, built on that redirected intensity, often carries a depth and force that calmer, more comfortable effort rarely produces. The subconscious as the connecting link. Between your conscious intention and the eventual physical result lies an enormous amount of processing you are never directly aware of. Pattern recognition, intuition, sudden insight that arrives without obvious cause. This subconscious layer functions as a connecting link, translating repeated conscious instruction into action that often feels spontaneous, even though it was actually built deliberately, over time, through everything discussed earlier in this lecture. The sudden idea that arrives in the shower, the unexpected solution that surfaces during an unrelated conversation. These are rarely random. They are the delayed output of instructions fed earlier, processed quietly, and delivered exactly when the connecting link has finished its work. The mind as a broadcasting instrument. Thought carries a kind of energy that extends beyond the privacy of a single skull, influencing posture, tone, presence, and the subtle signals other people read before a single word is spoken. A mind dominated by doubt broadcasts that doubt outward, whether or not the person speaking is aware of it, and other people respond to that broadcast more than they respond to whatever words are actually said. A mind dominated by clear purpose and quiet confidence broadcasts that instead. And the difference in how people respond to those two broadcasts, all else being equal, is significant enough to change the outcome of negotiations, relationships, and opportunities that depend on first impressions formed before any factual case has even been made. The sixth sense of accumulated wisdom. There comes a point, after enough disciplined application of everything described so far, where decisions begin to arrive with a kind of immediate clarity that wasn't available earlier in the process. This is not mysticism. It is the natural result of pattern recognition built through sustained, deliberate practice, operating quickly enough beneath conscious awareness that the output feels instant rather than calculated. People who reach this stage are often described as having strong instincts, as though instinct were a gift handed out at birth, rather than a capacity built methodically, through exactly the kind of disciplined repetition outlined throughout this entire lecture. This stage cannot be rushed and cannot be faked convincingly for very long. It arrives only after enough genuine repetition has accumulated, and it tends to arrive quietly, noticed mostly in hindsight. Once a person realizes how much faster and more confidently their decisions have become compared to where they started. The fears that quietly govern behavior. A handful of underlying fears tend to operate beneath nearly every hesitation, every premature retreat, every decision made from anxiety rather than clarity. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of failing publicly, fear of being unable to recover from a setback. Left unexamined, these fears govern behavior far more than people realize, shaping choices that are explained afterward with more rational-sounding justifications. Examined directly, named specifically, and tested against their actual likelihood rather than their emotional intensity, most of these fears shrink considerably, revealing themselves as far less probable and far less catastrophic than they felt while operating silently in the background. The discipline here is simple to describe and difficult to practice consistently. Name the specific fear out loud, ask what it's actually predicting, and then ask honestly how likely that specific prediction really is. Fear examined this directly almost always loses some of its grip, because fear depends heavily on remaining vague and unexamined to maintain its full intensity. The discipline of habit. Nearly everything described in this lecture eventually has to become habitual to actually function over the long stretches required for real achievement. A discipline practiced only when convenient, only when motivation happens to be present, will never accumulate enough repetition to produce the results promised throughout this architecture. Habit is what carries a person through the long, unglamorous middle of any pursuit, the stretch after the initial excitement has faded and before any external reward has yet appeared. The construction of a new habit is rarely as difficult as people assume, provided it's approached correctly. A habit anchored to a specific, consistent trigger, performed at the same time in the same context, repeated without exception for a sustained early period, eventually requires far less willpower to maintain than the same action attempted inconsistently at varying times, dependent entirely on remembering to do it. Build the habit once, correctly, and it will continue carrying you long after the motivation that first inspired it has completely disappeared. The influence of environment. Few forces shape behavior as powerfully or as invisibly as the environment a person spends the most time inside. A surrounding environment saturated with distraction, complaint, and low ambition exerts a constant, quiet pressure toward those same qualities, regardless of how strong any individual's personal discipline happens to be. A surrounding environment saturated with focus, ambition, and disciplined effort exerts the opposite pressure, often making difficult habits feel considerably easier simply because everything nearby is reinforcing rather than undermining them. This is precisely why changing surroundings, even temporarily, often produces breakthroughs that years of willpower alone could not. The discipline required to maintain focus in a hostile environment is simply larger than the discipline required to maintain the exact same focus in a supportive one. Recognizing this is not an excuse to wait for perfect conditions before beginning. It's an invitation to deliberately curate whatever environment is currently available, removing what undermines the purpose and adding, wherever possible, whatever reinforces it. Solitude as a tool of clarity. Modern life rarely permits extended stretches of true solitude, and this absence carries a cost that's easy to overlook, precisely because it's so normalized. Deliberately scheduled solitude, even brief stretches, free from devices, free from obligation, free from the expectation of producing anything specific during that time, often produces clarity that no amount of additional research or conversation can replicate. This is not laziness disguised as productivity. It is recognizing that certain essential mental work simply cannot occur under constant noise, and protecting the conditions that work actually requires. Criticism and the opinion of others. Every person pursuing anything worth achieving will, at some point, encounter criticism, much of it offered by people who have never attempted anything remotely similar themselves. This criticism carries an outsized emotional weight relative to its actual relevance, largely because human beings are wired ancestrally to weigh social disapproval heavily, a survival mechanism from an era when social rejection carried far more literal danger than it does today. Recognizing this mechanism for what it is, an outdated alarm system reacting disproportionately to a modern, largely harmless trigger, allows a person to weigh criticism more accurately. Some criticism contains genuinely useful information and deserves careful consideration. Far more criticism contains nothing but the critic's own discomfort with watching someone else attempt what they themselves were too afraid to try. Learning to sort quickly between these two categories, without dismissing all criticism reflexively, is one of the quieter but more valuable disciplines available to anyone pursuing a difficult visible goal. Health and vitality. As the foundation, nearly every principle described in this lecture depends ultimately on a body and mind capable of sustaining effort over time, and this foundation is frequently the first thing sacrificed by people pursuing ambitious goals, often with the justification that health can be addressed later, once the goal has been achieved. This trait is almost always a poor one. A depleted body produces a depleted mind, and a depleted mind cannot sustain the persistence, the clarity, or the disciplined repetition that achievement actually requires. Protecting basic physical foundations, adequate rest, reasonable movement, sound nutrition, is not a distraction from the pursuit of a goal. It is the maintenance required to keep the actual instrument capable of pursuing that goal at all. A person who burns through their physical foundation in pursuit of an ambitious aim frequently arrives at the goal, if they arrive at all, too depleted to actually enjoy or sustain what they've built. The difference between wishing and willing. Wishing is passive. It imagines a result without committing to the discomfort required to produce it. Willing is active. It accepts the discomfort in advance, having already decided that the result is worth whatever price will be required along the way. This distinction explains why so many people who sincerely want a particular outcome never actually move toward it. They have confused the intensity of their wishing with the presence of actual will. And the two are not the same thing at all. Will can be measured fairly simply, by observing what a person is willing to do when the wishing alone has stopped producing any pleasant feeling. The wish that survives only as long as it feels good was never will in the first place. The wish that continues producing action even after the pleasant feeling has faded has crossed, somewhere along the way, into something considerably more durable. Repetition. As the architecture of mastery, mastery in any field is built almost entirely through repetition. Refined slightly with each pass, sustained far longer than the initial enthusiasm for the pursuit would naturally last on its own. The 1000th repetition of a skill bears almost no resemblance to the first attempt. Not because some external gift was suddenly granted along the way, but because each repetition compounded on the one before it, building a depth that no single burst of effort could ever replicate. This is precisely why consistency outperforms intensity over any meaningful stretch of time. A person practicing moderately but daily will almost always surpass a person practicing intensely but sporadically, because the daily practitioner is compounding while the sporadic one keeps resetting back toward a beginner's foundation every time momentum is lost. Gratitude as a multiplier of effort. It would be incomplete to describe an architecture built entirely on effort, discipline, and persistence without acknowledging the role gratitude plays in sustaining all of it. A pursuit experienced entirely through the lens of lack, focusing only on what hasn't yet been achieved, becomes exhausting in a way that's difficult to sustain across the long timelines real achievement actually requires. Deliberately noticing what has already been built, however small relative to the final goal, restores a kind of energy that pure striving alone tends to drain. This is not a suggestion to become complacent or satisfied with less than what you're capable of. It's a recognition that sustained effort requires sustained energy, and gratitude, practiced honestly rather than performed superficially, is one of the more reliable sources of that energy across a long pursuit. The definite aim versus the general wish. There is a meaningful difference between wanting more in a general sense and wanting something specific, defined clearly enough that progress toward it can actually be measured. A general wish for more success, more money, more recognition sounds ambitious but functions almost like no aim at all, because it offers no way to evaluate whether any particular action moves toward it or away from it. A definite aim, by contrast, names the specific outcome, the specific timeline, and the specific standard by which arrival will be recognized. This specificity does something subtle but powerful to the mind holding it. A vague wish leaves the subconscious layer described earlier with no clear target to organize around, and so it organizes around nothing in particular, drifting along with whatever happens to be loudest on a given day. A definite aim gives that same subconscious layer an actual destination, and once given a destination, it begins, quietly and persistently, filtering incoming information for anything relevant to reaching it. People who achieve unusual things are rarely the ones who wanted the most in a general sense. They are almost always the ones who wanted something specific enough to actually aim at. Ambition without arrogance. There is a particular tension worth addressing directly, because it trips up a great many capable people before they ever get moving. The fear that pursuing an ambitious aim, openly and seriously, makes a person arrogant, or sets them up for public embarrassment if the aim isn't reached. This fear deserves a closer look because it conflates two very different things: confidence in a goal and certainty of its outcome. A person can hold an ambitious aim seriously, work toward it with full commitment, and remain entirely humble about the fact that the outcome is not guaranteed. Humility, properly understood, is not the absence of ambition. It is simply an accurate relationship with uncertainty, an honest acknowledgement that effort improves the odds of an outcome without ever fully controlling it. Ambition paired with this kind of humility moves forward steadily, undisturbed by the fear of looking foolish, because looking foolish was never actually the risk that mattered. Never attempting the aim at all was always the larger risk, simply a quieter one, easier to avoid noticing. The question of timing. A common and reasonable hesitation involves timing, the sense that conditions are not yet right, that more preparation, more resources, or more favorable circumstances are needed before a serious aim can responsibly begin. Some of this caution is warranted. Reckless timing, ignoring genuinely relevant information, produces avoidable failure. But, far more often, the sense that timing isn't right is simply fear, dressed in the more respectable language of patience and preparation. There is a useful test for telling these two apart. Genuine timing concerns are specific, naming an exact piece of missing information or resource that would meaningfully change the approach. Fear disguised as timing concerns tends to be vague, citing a general sense that things aren't ready without being able to specify exactly what would need to change. If the concern can't be named specifically, it usually isn't about timing at all. It's simply discomfort, looking for a more acceptable explanation than the plain truth that beginning feels frightening. Why comparison distorts the view? Difficult pursuits become exponentially harder the moment they're evaluated against someone else's apparently easier path, someone else's apparently faster timeline, someone else's apparently smoother circumstances. This comparison accomplishes nothing productive. It simply adds a second layer of difficulty, not just the pursuit itself, but the additional belief that the pursuit is somehow uniquely unfair compared to what everyone else seems to be experiencing. What makes comparison especially distorting is that it almost always compares an accurate, detailed view of your own struggle against an incomplete, curated view of someone else's progress. Nearly everyone presents their journey selectively, emphasizing the moments that look impressive and omitting the long, uneventful stretches that made up most of the actual work. Comparing your full, unfiltered experience against someone else's highlight reel will always produce a distorted, discouraging picture, regardless of how that other person's actual journey unfolded behind the scenes. Service as the foundation of lasting reward. There is a pattern observed repeatedly across very different fields that the achievements which endure longest tend to be the ones built around solving a genuine problem for other people, rather than built purely around personal gain extracted without giving anything of comparable value in return. This is not a sentimental claim. It is a practical observation about sustainability. Pursuits built purely around extraction tend to attract resistance, eventually, from the people being extracted from, while pursuits built around genuine service tend to attract support, cooperation, and goodwill that compounds over time in ways that extraction never does. This reframes ambition usefully for anyone uncomfortable with pursuing personal achievement for its own sake. The aim does not need to be framed as selfish acquisition. It can be framed honestly as solving a specific problem well enough that other people are glad to reward the solution. Approached this way, ambition and genuine care for others stop being in tension with each other and start reinforcing each other directly. The discipline of specialization. There is a strong temptation, particularly early in any pursuit, to remain a generalist, dabbling across many adjacent skills without committing fully to depth in any single one. Generalism feels safer because it avoids the vulnerability of being measured directly against specialists in a narrow field. But the architecture of achievement described throughout this lecture rewards depth far more reliably than it rewards breadth. A specific narrow skill, developed to a genuinely high level, produces a kind of value that a moderate skill spread across many areas simply cannot match. This does not mean breadth has no value at all. It means breadth functions best as a foundation laid early, before eventually narrowing deliberately into the specific area where the deepest, most differentiated value can actually be built. Remaining a generalist indefinitely, never narrowing, is one of the quieter ways ambitious people avoid the discomfort of being truly tested in a single specific arena. The danger of the shortcut. Every pursuit worth undertaking eventually presents what appears to be a shortcut, a way to skip some portion of the difficult, unglamorous work in exchange for a faster route to the appearance of the desired result. Some shortcuts are genuinely useful, eliminating unnecessary friction without sacrificing the substance of the work. Many others are not shortcuts at all, but substitutions, trading the actual development of skill or value for something that merely resembles it on the surface. The danger of the false shortcut is rarely immediate. It usually surfaces later, often at the exact moment real testing arrives, when the gap between appearance and substance finally gets exposed under pressure. The danger of the shortcut. Every pursuit worth undertaking eventually presents what appears to be a shortcut, a way to skip some portion of the difficult, unglamorous work in exchange for a faster route to the appearance of the desired result. Some shortcuts are genuinely useful, eliminating unnecessary friction without sacrificing the substance of the work. Many others are not shortcuts at all, but substitutions, trading the actual development of skill or value for something that merely resembles it on the surface. The danger of the false shortcut is rarely immediate. It usually surfaces later, often at the exact moment real testing arrives, when the gap between appearance and substance finally gets exposed under pressure. The discipline here is asking honestly before taking any apparent shortcut whether it removes friction without removing substance, or whether it simply defers a reckoning that will eventually have to be paid anyway, usually at a worse time and a higher cost than if the original work had simply been done properly the first time. Consistency over raw talent. Talent, in the way it's commonly discussed, refers to an early aptitude that makes initial progress in a skill feel easier than it does for someone without that aptitude. This early advantage is real, but it is consistently overstated in how much it determines eventual outcomes. Consistency, sustained over years rather than weeks, routinely surpasses raw talent unaccompanied by that same consistency, simply because compounding effort, even starting from a lower baseline, eventually overtakes a higher baseline that stopped compounding early. This should be considerably more encouraging than it usually sounds. It means the absence of obvious early talent is not disqualifying. It means the presence of obvious early talent is not by itself sufficient. The actual determining factor across nearly every account of sustained achievement worth studying is which person kept showing up, refining and compounding their effort, long after the initial novelty of either talent or its absence had stopped being the most relevant variable in the room. The role of mentorship. No architecture of achievement is complete without acknowledging the accelerating effect of learning directly from someone who has already navigated the specific terrain ahead. A mentor does not remove the need for personal effort, persistence, or decision. What a mentor provides is compressed experience, the ability to avoid certain costly mistakes simply by being warned about them in advance, rather than discovering them firsthand at full cost. Seeking this kind of guidance is not a sign of inadequate self-reliance. It is simply efficient use of available resources, recognizing that some lessons can be transferred directly through guidance, while others can only be earned through direct personal experience regardless of how much guidance is available. The discipline is knowing which category a given lesson falls into, accepting guidance where it can genuinely accelerate the process, and accepting the necessity of direct experience where no amount of second-hand advice can substitute for it. Learning from failure without being defined by it. Failure, examined honestly rather than avoided or dramatized, is one of the most efficient sources of specific, actionable information available anywhere in the entire pursuit. The discipline required is treating a failed attempt as data to be analyzed rather than as evidence of personal inadequacy to be absorbed and carried forward as identity. These are two entirely different responses to the exact same event. and the difference between them often determines whether a single failure becomes a brief, useful lesson or a long-term obstacle that quietly undermines every subsequent attempt. Analyzing failure well requires a kind of detachment that's genuinely difficult to maintain in the immediate aftermath when the emotional sting is still fresh. This is precisely why a brief period of distance, sufficient to let the initial emotional charge settle before conducting the actual analysis, tends to produce far more useful conclusions than analysis attempted in the heat of immediate disappointment. Beginning before you feel ready. Very few people in any field ever report feeling fully ready at the moment they actually began the pursuit that eventually defined their achievement. Readiness, in the way most people imagine it, a complete absence of uncertainty, a fully developed skill set, total confidence in the outcome, simply does not arrive before meaningful action. It arrives, if it arrives at all, only after a substantial amount of action has already been taken, often well into the pursuit rather than before it. This means waiting for readiness before beginning is, for most people, equivalent to waiting indefinitely, since the readiness they're waiting for was never going to arrive through waiting in the first place. The discipline is beginning anyway, treating the discomfort of feeling unready as the normal, expected condition of starting something genuinely new, rather than as evidence that starting should be postponed until some future point when the discomfort has resolved on its own. Thinking in longer time frames. Much of the discouragement that derails ambitious pursuits comes from measuring progress against time frames that were never realistic in the first place. Expecting in months what genuinely required years, and then mistaking the absence of fast progress for evidence of failure. Extending the time frame under consideration deliberately often reveals a far more encouraging picture than the same data examined over a shorter window. This is not an invitation toward complacency or an excuse for lack of urgency in daily effort. It is simply an accurate recalibration of expectations, recognizing that nearly everything of substantial value, examined honestly, required considerably longer to build than the optimistic estimates made at the outset. Holding both truths simultaneously, urgency in daily action and patience in overall timeline, is one of the more difficult but more necessary balances required throughout any serious pursuit. Building momentum through small wins. Momentum, once established, makes nearly every subsequent step easier than it would otherwise be, and momentum is built almost entirely through the accumulation of small, completed actions rather than through waiting for a single large breakthrough to provide it. A small win, properly recognized, rather than dismissed as insignificant, generates a measurable increase in confidence and energy that carries directly into the next action attempted. This is why breaking a large, intimidating aim into smaller, clearly defined steps serves a purpose well beyond simple organization. Each completed step generates real momentum that compounds into the next, building a kind of forward motion that a single, distant, undivided goal rarely generates on its own. The large aim remains the destination. The small steps are what actually generate the energy required to keep moving toward it. The cost of perfectionism. Perfectionism presents itself as a commitment to high standards, but functions in practice far more often as a sophisticated form of avoidance, delaying action indefinitely under the justification that the work isn't yet good enough to be shown or shared. This distinction matters considerably because genuine high standards and perfectionism produce very different behavior. Genuine high standards produce completed work, refined through honest revision. Perfectionism produces endless, unfinished revision, frequently avoiding the vulnerability of ever actually completing and releasing anything at all. The discipline here involves recognizing perfectionism for what it actually is in the moment it appears, a fear of judgment wearing the more acceptable costume of high standards, and choosing to complete and release the work at a genuinely good though imperfect standard, rather than continuing to revise indefinitely in pursuit of a perfection that was never actually the real obstacle in the first place. Identity is the underlying determinant. Beneath all of the specific principles and disciplines covered throughout this lecture lies a deeper variable that ultimately determines how consistently any of them get applied. The underlying identity a person holds about who they fundamentally are. A person who privately believes themselves to be someone who quits when things get difficult will tend to quit, regardless of how many techniques for persistence they've studied. A person who has begun to genuinely identify as someone who continues regardless of difficulty will tend to continue, often without needing to consciously apply any particular technique at all. This means the deepest work available in this entire architecture is not simply applying each principle individually, but gradually allowing the consistent application of those principles to actually reshape the underlying identity beneath them. Each time a difficult action is taken despite discomfort, evidence accumulates that contradicts the older, more limited identity. And over enough repetition, the newer identity, the one capable of doing what the pursuit actually requires, becomes the more accurate description of who that person has genuinely become. Recognizing and honoring progress. It is easy, in the middle of an ambitious pursuit, to focus exclusively on the remaining distance to the final goal, while overlooking the substantial distance already covered. This habit, left unchecked, produces a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction regardless of how much progress has actually occurred, because attention has been trained to notice only the gap rather than the ground already gained. Deliberately pausing, periodically, to honestly assess how far the pursuit has actually come, compared specifically to where it started rather than compared to the final destination, restores a kind of energy that pure, forward-focused striving tends to deplete over time. This practice does not require lowering the final aim or becoming satisfied with less than what remains possible. It simply requires accurately crediting the work already completed, which tends to be the single most overlooked piece of information in any sustained, ambitious pursuit. Vision held in specific detail. There is a meaningful difference between picturing an outcome in vague general terms and picturing it with enough specific sensory detail that it functions almost like a memory rather than a hope. A vague vision, something like picturing oneself as successful, gives the mind very little to actually work with. A specific vision, picturing the precise scene, the precise setting, the precise feeling of that particular moment, gives the mind something concrete enough to actually rehearse, repeatedly, until it begins influencing posture and decision in the present. This level of detail requires real effort to construct, far more than the brief, generic daydreaming most people default to when imagining their own future. The effort is worth making. A vision held in vivid, specific detail behaves differently inside the architecture described throughout this lecture than a vague wish ever could, providing the deeper layers of mind with an actual target precise enough to organize around, rather than a general direction too blurry to meaningfully act upon. The risk of seeking validation too early. There is a particular vulnerability that appears early in any ambitious pursuit. When the work is still unfinished, unproven, and far from its eventual form, the temptation to seek approval, encouragement, or validation from others before the work has had enough time to develop its own substance. This timing matters considerably. Early stage work, shared too widely too soon, often receives feedback shaped more by the work's unfinished state than by its actual underlying merit. And that feedback, taken too seriously at this fragile stage, can derail a direction that simply needed more time to mature before being fairly judged at all. The discipline here is protecting early work long enough to let it develop real substance before exposing it to outside judgment, reserving feedback seeking for a stage where the work can actually be evaluated on its real potential rather than its unfinished rough edges. This is not secrecy for its own sake. It is simply recognizing that timing matters as much in seeking feedback as it does in every other part of this architecture. Reputation built through small proof, trust, whether from others or from oneself, is rarely built through a single dramatic demonstration. It accumulates, slowly, through a consistent pattern of smaller proofs, kept commitments, completed promises, reliable follow-through on matters too minor for anyone to specifically notice in isolation, but significant in aggregate over enough repetition. This accumulated pattern eventually produces something considerably more valuable than any single impressive achievement could produce on its own. A settled, well-earned confidence held by others and by oneself that this particular person can actually be relied upon. This reframes the seemingly small commitments scattered throughout ordinary days, returning a message promptly, following through on a minor favor, finishing a task exactly as promised, as far more consequential than they initially appear. Each one is a small deposit into the same account that eventually funds the larger trust required for bigger opportunities to even become available in the first place. The discipline of saying no every yes given to something outside the actual aim is, in effect, a smaller no given to the aim itself, simply by virtue of the limited time and energy any single person has available. Few people examine their commitments through this lens, and as a result, many find themselves stretched thin across obligations that have very little to do with the outcome they claim to be pursuing most seriously. Learning to decline requests, invitations, and even genuinely good opportunities that do not serve the definite aim is not selfishness. It is simply protecting the limited resource of attention and time required to actually build whatever the aim demands. This discipline tends to feel uncomfortable at first, particularly for anyone accustomed to deriving a sense of worth from being agreeable and accommodating to every request. The discomfort fades with practice, replaced eventually by the clarity of a life increasingly organized around what actually matters most. And energy is the resource that matters most? Time management, the conventional advice offered to nearly everyone pursuing an ambitious aim, addresses only part of the actual constraint. Time spent without sufficient energy produces far less than the same amount of time spent with energy fully available. This means managing energy, protecting it deliberately through adequate rest, appropriate boundaries, and realistic expectations of output matters at least as much as managing the clock itself. A person who schedules their most demanding work during their lowest energy hours, simply because that's when the calendar happened to have space, will consistently underperform a person who deliberately aligns their most demanding work with their highest energy windows, even if the second person has on paper less total time available. The architecture of achievement depends on energy as much as it depends on hours, and protecting that energy deserves the same deliberate attention typically reserved only for scheduling. The colleague helped without expectation of immediate return. The connection maintained without an obvious current purpose. The favor extended simply because it was the right thing to do. These often turn out much later to have been some of the most consequential decisions made throughout the entire pursuit, even though their value was completely invisible at the moment they occurred. Finding the process itself worth living. A pursuit experienced only as a means to a distant future reward becomes exhausting in a particular way that's difficult to sustain across the long timelines real achievement requires. The mind, focused entirely on a future that hasn't arrived yet, struggles to draw any sustaining satisfaction from the present moment, regardless of how much progress that present moment actually represents. Deliberately cultivating genuine engagement with the process itself, not merely tolerance of it as an unpleasant requirement on the way to something better, transforms the felt experience of the entire pursuit considerably. This does not require pretending every part of the process is enjoyable. It requires locating honestly whatever genuine satisfaction is available within the work itself and giving that satisfaction full attention, rather than constantly displacing all possible satisfaction onto a distant future outcome that hasn't yet arrived and may take considerably longer to arrive than initially hoped. Holding the aim fixed while releasing the path. There is an important distinction between commitment to an outcome and commitment to a single specific path toward that outcome. Rigid attachment to one particular method, one particular sequence of steps, often becomes a liability the moment circumstances change in ways the original method never anticipated. Each time a person acts despite fear, rather than waiting for fear to disappear before acting, the capacity for future courageous action strengthens slightly. The same way any other repeated exercise strengthens the specific capacity being exercised. This means courage does not need to be waited for as a prerequisite to beginning a difficult pursuit. It can be built deliberately through the pursuit itself, by repeatedly choosing action over avoidance in moderately uncomfortable situations, gradually increasing the size of the discomfort tolerated as the capacity strengthens over time. A person who waits to feel courageous before acting will likely wait indefinitely. A person who acts despite the absence of courage will eventually develop the very capacity they were originally waiting for. Closing the distance between knowing and doing. Nearly everything described throughout this lecture is in some form already known by a great many people who have never applied it consistently enough to produce the results it's capable of producing. This gap between knowing and doing is in fact the single largest obstacle standing between most people and the achievement they claim to want, far larger than any gap in available information or technique. Closing this gap requires no additional knowledge beyond what has already been covered throughout this entire lecture. It requires simply the decision to apply what's already understood consistently, starting now, rather than continuing to gather additional understanding indefinitely as a more comfortable substitute for the actual application that alone produces results. The architecture has been described in full. What remains is entirely a matter of whether it gets lived, starting today, in the specific, ordinary actions available to you in this exact moment. The architecture in motion. None of the principles described in this lecture function particularly well in isolation. Desire without organized planning drifts. Planning without persistence collapses at the first real obstacle. Persistence without faith eventually exhausts itself for lack of conviction. The entire architecture works because each piece reinforces the others, forming a structure considerably stronger than any single principle could produce alone. This is precisely why scattered, half-hearted attempts at self-improvement so often fail to produce lasting change. A single principle, applied without the others supporting it, is simply one column standing alone, vulnerable to the first real weight placed against it. The full architecture, built deliberately and maintained consistently, is what actually holds. The quiet beginning of everything. Return for a moment to where this lecture began. A single thought, invisible, unproven, existing nowhere except inside one mind. Every principle covered tonight exists for a single purpose: to take that invisible thought and carry it deliberately through faith, through organized knowledge, through imagination, through planning, through decision, through persistence, through the support of aligned minds, through the redirection of emotion, through habit, through environment, through health, through gratitude, until it finally crosses the threshold from thought into thing. This has never been a process reserved for the exceptional few. It has simply been a process most people never complete, abandoning it somewhere in the middle, usually exactly where the difficulty was highest and the breakthrough was closest. The architecture is available to you, right now, in whatever form your current desire takes. It was always going to require everything described tonight. It was never going to require anything you don't already have access to building.